one of the main questions that we have right now and that we will explore in this workshop is based on your expertise, very different areas, from like policymakers to scholars. What are the assumptions that you see others making about the many benefits of AI and the limitations of those assumptions? We can start with Blair. You have to touch me.
Thank you. Thank you, Jess, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here today and for everyone to organize this event today. I think one of the main limitations that I see in my own work, I do a lot of work around AI governance, AI policy, working both with policymakers in government as well as practitioners, AI development.
Sorry, your mic on?
Turn on the mic.
Not on.
Some people who like to carry.
Good.
Oh, there.
Yeah.
Okay. So a main challenge that I kind of see looking across a lot of the AI policy governance work that I do with practitioners in industry, as well as policymakers and government, community organizers and activists as well, is kind of an over-reliance on like top-down forms of government that are come from the state or come from the industry way. And a limitation with that is that when we have conversations about regulation, about governance, they're often kind of framed through the lens of, how can the state help us organize governance? How can industry perhaps organize governance? What interventions can we make in those spaces? Whereas, building capacity, building awareness within workplaces or within communities that are affected by AI, that's often kind of on the periphery of questions of AI policy or AI governance. And one thing that I think that we kind of take away as a lesson from the WGA and SAG-AFTRA prospects last year, for example, is that there are lots of possibilities for worker-led AI regulation, especially when it comes to creative cultural spaces, right? So one kind of limitation I see with a lot of the conversations around regulation governance is this kind of emphasis on a top-down perspective. And, today's theme of reimagining AI, I do kind of wonder, part of reimagining AI, part of reimagining AI policy is thinking about regulation through a more bottom-up lens. Like, how can we kind of organize communities, workers from below in order to build capacity and build policy that works at the level of communities and at the level of workers.
Thank you so much.
First, again, thank you everyone for having me. Reimagining, I'm the director of Building Test Academy for the city of Philadelphia. I'm commonly referred to as the Necktown Mayor. My portfolio includes everything that our city happens at 5 o'clock, which is, again, policymaking, but it also includes our hospitality sector, all of our entertainment, so all the clubs, bars, venues, especially a lot of music venues, artists who operate in there. And I think from a couple views, because I look at this from not only a policy point of view, but a creative point of view, right? We're looking at artists, the venues, music, and that entertainment space. I think there is the positives of AI, and that a lot of people are talking about, is that, it frees up your ability to really think big picture. A lot of our workforce, or a lot of times, it takes us 2 seconds to respond to an email or 2 seconds to answer a question and draft a brief. But, in our mind, with the actual putting it together might take you 2 days. It's exciting. Now you can use a tool, a generative AI tool like that. Hey, these are my thoughts. I want to put it in a memo. You get it in 30 seconds. And so it increases productivity. I think we're seeing that a lot. I also teach at the university, at Drexel University, in the business school, and I teach my students how to utilize AI, and even one thing with like job searching is like, take your resume, take the job description, let AI pull out those things that are great, and you fill in where your strengths are. I think when we look at it from a creative point of view, and some of the potential complications of AI comes with IP. If I am a songwriter and I utilize a generative AI tool to help me write a song, well, who owns the IP? There's ChatGPT and OpenAI own part of that IP. Should I be giving them credit on the album or for the writer's credit, or is it me because I put the initial thoughts in? And that can be seen with anything, with any of our works of art, whether it's literature, again, songwriting, or any other things that we are appreciate or we celebrate. And so I think those are the things that are going to be the complicated part. I think to piggyback off there from the policy point of view is that most governments are reactive. We do not make policies that predict or work for future uses. It's like, okay, AI does this now, and then it takes a year behind to make the policy for what AI does now. But what about what AI will do in the future? And I think a good example of how government is playing catch up is with the EV and automated driving vehicles market. Like, we could be so much further along in the progress of that, but the states are separating in the progress where California is leading, Nevada's leading, Pennsylvania's far behind. I can go to Vegas and get in a self-driving taxi easily, but in PA, they're not allowed yet. And so how do we, as government, make rules or policies that are predictive, right? Okay, what is AI going to be used in the future, and how do we keep up with that? So I think that's one of the big parts of it from a policy point of view, kind of what you touched on.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Jess, for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here. As you might tell, I'm the only foreigner here from my accent. That's great. And that's why I wrote some notes, because I don't want to make mistakes. So yeah, first of all, by thanking Jess, I also extend the also thanks to the members of the UVA. Let me introduce a little bit my team. I'm part of a research group called Trace. We also have different names, but we are a multidisciplinary group made of technologists, cultural economists, architects, as I am, and planners. And we work under the umbrella of urban innovation, which says basically nothing and everything. But we mainly use research action methodology to investigate the city. When I say the city, I also mean the territory which are off the beaten track, also territories that do not matter. We try to reduce the gap between the digital analysis, the site-specific creative intervention, and scientific research method. A part of our work involves the preservation and valorization of material and immaterial cultural heritage. So we work with cultural-led regeneration, especially against the challenges and vulnerability that causes climate and social risks. And also we try to investigate how to tackle this topic by making the best use of urban digital twins to accompany the cultural heritage-led urban regeneration at the intersection of all these environmental and social risks. We work with communities as core researcher, especially transient and hard-to-reach groups who often are left outside traditional legal frameworks, but also research as well. So in this field, various fields of research, AI, of course, plays a crucial role, but only if certain conditions are met. One of these is that the AI infrastructure should allow to go beyond data collection, moving from automation, which was very critical in smart cities, to more on the sort of autonomy. To provide new analytical and narrative means to give voice to diverse community perspective, even conflictual, because I think cultural heritage is made of conflict. And it can allow to build a dialogue in a way with them and with different levels of institutional, formal and informal actors. So in the field of cultural heritage regeneration, AI, of course, is an excellent tool to process data, but it struggles to account the unpredictability, the unknown nature of human and urban dynamics, so particularly in the diverse and multi-layered context of historic city where I work. And another aspect that we often consider as critical is the AI act of making decisions, so the decision-making power of AI, which might seem innovative, even neutral, but it could, of course, echo existing ideologies and regimes and even become conservative. So in this case, it's critical that the cultural autonomy and responsibility is retained. So we try to decenter a little bit the characterization, also the aesthetic and the tone of AI, while also ensuring that the tool that we use, mainly platforms, remain transparent, participatory, and capable of going beyond counting, which is another characteristic of smart city, by rather producing accounts. So basic, simple, clear, not over-detailed narratives that explains why and how certain things occur in the city. So this way, AI's accounts can be interpreted, expanded, and then acted upon by the most diverse stakeholders. So this is the posture that we impose ourselves when we work with AI, which requires, of course, collaboration with different urban scholars, ethnographers, anthropologists, whose expertise might open up further opportunities for us to take action, and to kind of create a socio-technical creative turn to optimize heritage sites, to enhance cultural-led regeneration, and to ensure the functionality, but also the resilience of cultural heritage.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and delighted to be here amongst these panelists. My work with AI largely is working with artists and with museum professionals and cultural heritage professionals to try to imagine how the technology might transform the work that they're doing. So on one level, it's equipping them with the literacies and skills to engage in this space. At the same time, I want to and have my own kind of robust critique of these tools as we move forward. So kind of critical literacy is important to me. And I'm happy to speak at some point about, where I see different applications of AI in museums and in cultural heritage scholarship or artists on the ground. But I wanted to highlight a few assumptions, I think, that are operative and one of them is at a 10,000 foot level. I think all of the work that we've been doing with AI always brackets the environmental impact as a condition of operation, as a condition of possibility. And I worry a lot about that mode, at least as AI is currently implemented, the ways in which it has absolutely significant ecological footprints, and the ways in which we mobilize that and perhaps justify it based on the ends through which we're trying to pursue the technology. So that certainly is something I wonder about, and wonder in the course of our conversations whether or not a politics of refusal might be a position we might engage. But in any case, and then amongst my colleagues, time and time again, artists and curators, I think in their engagements with this, have an assumption that this will not eventually replace their work, right? And I'm not saying that it will. But there's always this kind of, well, of course, it's not going to replace us anytime soon. And then there's a wink and say, or yet, right? And what I would love for that conversation to open up onto is a real hard look at what kinds of knowing and practices and expertise go into these creative practices, curatorial practices, to really think about the ways in which, at least as it's currently conceived, how a lot of AI functions in an extractive sense, and I think can be productively read against a longer history of technologies that seek to automate by expropriating expertise and knowledge, creativity. And then finally, this mostly is an assumption I think that goes into a lot of the critiques as well from my colleagues, and one that I embrace in the sense that there's something exceptional about human practice, right? Human creativity. And this is certainly an argument that is worth exploring, human abilities and how machines fall short. What I worry about is, in relation to my own work in disability justice, is how that tends to uphold ideals about humanity that are, if not normal, at least, or normative, often ideal, right? The sense that, we should be asking the question, what is intelligence when we're talking about artificial intelligence? How broadly is it thought? What kinds of knowing are brought to the fore? What kinds of ways of being in the world, embodied ways of being in the world, are privileged? It's both a question of access on some level, who's developing and building these technologies, but also it's a question, I think, more broadly about the epistemologies of what counts as creativity, what counts as, we tend to fetishize the unassisted, right? The creative genius who can do this without a tool. And, the long history, we are deeply entangled, and we've always been entangled with our technologies. And so from the flip side, I worry about how we normatize humanness and the things.
And I as well would like to thank Dr. May and Dr. Wang for organizing this marvelous event, inviting me and the generous hospitality. The focus of much of my research over the last 10 years has been the nighttime culture of cities. So I'm honored to share this panel with Reimagining, who is, a global known figure in this field. And I'm interested in the values, the policies, the other things that surround nighttime culture, but I have a long-standing interest in urban cultural heritage, with how cities remember their culture, how they make use of or work to erase that culture. And as I was thinking about what I might say on this panel, and I'm not sure I can respond exactly to the question, but I did a lot of reading around this on AI relationship to urban culture preservation, and we can say sustainability. And I became quite fixated on two different sort of bodies of thinking. One is the role of AI in mapping the historical built environment in cities. There's a lot of scholarship. I read about 25 articles about how cities, most of them in Eastern Europe, but throughout Europe, and most of them working under UNESCO mandates, use IA to basically track changes in the built environment. Often by working with photographs, but noting, in buildings that are protected or that have a historical value, what does it mean when an owner changes a minor aspect of the doors or the windows? What disappears from historical memory then? And this, involves a kind of machine-based skills and visual analysis that I know come in part out of art historians working with and architectural historians working with AI. And the more I dug into this, the more I began wondering about whether more recent urban heritage, like the heritage of nightlife venues in the city in which I live, could be subject to this kind of analysis. For example, Montreal has a history, an important mid-20th century history of jazz clubs, of a whole music scenes that were in part founded on African-American populations who moved to Montreal working for railroad companies, established networks of clubs. They were part of touring circuits and so on. Later on in the 1970s, Montreal had the very significant discotheque community that was grounded in LGBTQ plus communities and made Montreal the second city for disco music on the continent. Are there ways, histories of that circulate in rumor, in oral histories and so on, but actually noting where in the built environment these things happened, how those places were changed, what buildings were adjacent, all of those things, can part of the sustainability of certain kinds of cultures be mapped through tools that are available with machine visual analysis and so on. Now, the other kind of thing I've been reading is very different. There have been a lot of a surprising kind of flurry of articles in the last few weeks even on AI tools that will help you plan what promoters call a perfect night out in cities like London in the UK. The idea is that AI will help you personalize your night. It will draw obviously on what it knows of your tastes and your past practices. It will take you to places where you're pretty sure that you're going to get in, or you will find others like yourself, and so on. And when we set these two kinds of AI against each other, the one, the sort of machine analysis of the visuality of nightlife, the other, very different kinds of personal itineraries, we get very different ideas of what AI could be. One is, basically depersonalizing the act of looking at the city. Jussi Parikka has said, and we know this, that most of what is looking at a city now is not people but machines. The visuality of the city is, for the large part of visuality that involves machines trained, whose site is trained on the city. Whereas tools to create a perfect night out in London are about a hyper-personalization of the experience of the city, where the AI, what AI is going to do is take the abundance of amenities and possibilities available to us and give us the one that is perfect for us. So I'm interested in pursuing those different dimensions in relationship to the cultural sphere and maybe the night cultural sphere in particular.
Chess, can I respond to that? Because I think you brought up something in Boston. With the nightlife part, and again, this is where we come alive at night. I think some of the concerns about those AI generative itineraries is one of the other bigger concerns about AI too, is that it's based off of hell of information. It's generated, right? So it searches what's out there. And so when you're talking about culture, and one thing that we talked about in Montreal and talking about a lot of our nighttime, conferences is like cultural erasure. It's happening in a lot of our cities with gentrification, these sorts of. If I ask AI, hey, I want a great night out, that's safe and fun. Well, who's to determine what safe is? What neighborhoods it is, right? It's the information that's out there. You have to be careful with that, because the person that controls the entity or the side faction that controls that information will then begin to shape what we see if we start relying just on AI and not our own personal experiences and safety that we like. Because again, if all the, black and brown disco and jazz spots are seen as unsafe or in unsafe neighborhoods, you won't get that answer in AI. They're like, okay, these are the safe ones, and they're all, culturally washed. And so I think you bring up a great point about the limitation to that aspect, but especially when you're looking at nightlife and culture, and you expand that limitation to anything because it's generative. It's going to search the internet. It's going to search what's out there. And if you control what's being put out there, then it can be problematic in how it'll shape human behavior to reinforce stereotypes and cultural erasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you. Great follow-up question. Because I see some similar topics like creating cities, like your cultural citizenship, then you are dealing with also the limitations of AI and things that we've been overlooking, especially in province. I would like if you could develop a little bit more, like, for example, the limitations of the work that you've been doing. If we would like to hear more about maybe the government perspective, like the everyday challenge that you face, because you mentioned policy briefly, like potential limitations. Martina, with the projects in it as well, like the digital twins, being a creator in museums, and look at this historical memory threats of it. The role of policy, and if you could develop that one. What?
So the main challenge that I see right now across a lot of the work that I'm involved in, research, teaching, advocacy work with the communities, LGBTQ plus communities out there, use AI policy issues too. The challenge I see as it relates to our conversation today is really a challenge of erosion, erosion of authenticity, erosion of trust, erosion of well-being. And what I mean by that is we have this really big challenge, and so as Abdul was mentioned a little bit about information, who's controlling the information that's generated by generative AI systems. We have a small handful of big tech companies who, in their pursuit of profitable generative AI projects, are eroding the quality and safety of our information ecosystems. They're eroding the trustworthiness of collective memory, of our ability to collectively make sense of the world. They're eroding the value of creative labor. They're eroding the livelihoods of creative workers, extractive data scraping practices, model development practices. Ultimately, this is all contributing to an erosion of political, democratic, cultural institutions, people's trust in those institutions. And I think the role of government in this has been this kind of dual role of, on the one hand, facilitating this erosion through public investment, funding of technological innovation, of industrial adoption of AI, subsidizing that. And then there's this other regulatory side too, where government has been to some extent, pushing back, resisting industry in some ways, but not in others, despite, I think, a flurry of regulatory activity we've been seeing coming out of governments all over the world. I primarily look at Canada, since I'm based in Canada. I'm very engaged with the Canadian AI governance landscape, but in the US as well. There's been lots of regulatory activity here, but none of it really has, in practice, meaningfully intervened in or prevented these issues of erosion from happening. And going back to WGA SAG-AFTRA strikes last year, backlashes we're seeing creative communities, artists using data masking tools like Blaze and Nightshade to protect their work, and it's being stolen by extractive generative AI developers. I think that kind of speaks to this vacuum of government regulation, right? Where in the absence of effective government regulation of these processes of erosion, of these processes of extraction, what's happening is kind of bottom-up, more grassroots approaches to regulation at the community and at the level of communities and at the level of workplaces to fill that gap. So that's kind of the main challenge that I see in those conversations relates to a lot of my work is, we have these big tech companies that are really contributing to a lot of negative impacts and as we mentioned before, there's some benefits to AI as well, but it comes with all of these risks. It comes with all of these harms, and it's not entirely clear what the most effective regulatory response to that should be at this moment.
I think, looking from government and a policy point of view, and again, I'll let you bring me in more of the nightlife part, nighttime part, but this general government policy making and how we do it, there is a role for AI. There's a role for a process for improving it in governance. And I've learned that I don't come from a government background, come from more of an industry entrepreneur background. That really moves incredibly too slow. And I'm not even talking about getting to making the policy. I'm talking about processing a permit. Like it's just so cumbersome sometimes. And again, it gets in its own way because the cumbersome through this comes from trying to ensure equity and then you add extra staffing. Before you know, the equity is washed out by the ability to be expedient and it cause people problems. We see that a lot in nightlife ownership, right? In Philly, if you have money and have a lawyer that knows the system, you get a spot open in a couple months. But if you are not from money or not from that experience, you're mom and pop, homegrown, then you're learning as you go, which costs you money, even though it's supposed to be these extra steps to ensure that. So I think there's a place for process improvement. I think the problem is that decision making for policies need to stay with humans. And the reason being is because, again, when you look at it's like I said, where, what's good for the gander is supposed to be good for the goose. Well, it's not the case, right? What's good for the group is sometimes very bad for the individual or small or, marginalized group. And so there has to be humans to be able to look at that and say, okay, this may be good for everybody, but we have to carve out something that is better or, equitable. And you get equitable is going above and beyond to pull everyone up to the same level. And I think AI, if we start using it for decision making, will erase some of the looking at the individual, because again, it's going to take what is the majority of the information out there and get we know who's controlling that. I think the other thing is there's a large perception issue when it comes to new technology. We've seen it before. Everybody thought Google was going to make the whole population smart, and it hasn't, because and I don't want to use that it was opposite effect, but I'll say that it hasn't, because when you look at Google, it started doing what some of the generative AI does now, which is it learns what you like. It looks at the things you shop and then feeds it back to you. And so, I always have this thing where you look at, these bubbles of people. Like, how could someone believe that? Well, because they're being fed a million times, a million ways, and generative AI will do the same. I use ChatGPT. I think it's a very effective tool. I ask ChatGPT, how can I help you better perform the job? It asks me questions about what my likes were, what my interests were. So then when I ask it to write a quick brief, it sounds like me. Now, my biases are in that, and it will continually feed and add to that. And then before it, whatever the AI or the technology is telling me what reality is, I'm ready to fight for it. I'm ready to go to bat for it because it's what I know to be true. And there's a whole separate bubble of world out there. So how do we make sure that AI is, confrontational in parts? And be like, hey, that thought process is actually not what is the reality, instead of feeding us back what it is. And I think that's a limitation that is, hard to regulate. And it comes to fighting back into big data. So bringing it back to you, like you have to fight who controls the information. You have companies that could literally change what everyone's AI here says by just a data dump, because they can control so much of the data. And then I think the last part of it is too, at a federal level specifically, but also we see this in all of our local government as well. It's a comprehension problem. I don't know if you guys ever see the testimony on the Hill with Mark Zuckerberg and the octogenarians that are in the city. He danced circles around them because they just didn't understand the system. They didn't understand. They kept like, hey, does Facebook sell data? He said no. They didn't know the next question to ask. Well, does Facebook allow the use of data, which is what they were trying to get to, that Facebook doesn't sell your data, but they will sell the use of it and allow companies to utilize your data without getting it to market directly to whatever your biases are. And so if we don't get a centralized government or policymakers that understand like what's the next question to get guardrails in, they will not be there. And the big data and the big companies will continue to control, and whatever their biases are will be the biases that we see. And that's why, again, we'll continue to polarize. And then those who are truth seekers become the minorities now. Now, those are crazy conspiracy theorists because they're telling the truth and they're not going with mainstream. So I think when you talk about the limitations from, again, policy making point of view, but can be applied everywhere, it's the guardrails. We got to put the guardrails in to make sure that the generative part of AI can also still challenge thought. I think it goes back to your part with the museum and like curating is that, humans challenge thought and processes. The humans that we learn and love about have challenged or always go against the grain. AI doesn't and isn't right now in a way to do that. And I think the scary part is when AI does learn, if it does learn to go against the grain, now that's scary. Because what if it goes against what we as humans want? So I'll leave it there before I give out any more of these dark parts of AI.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will start with the goods, just to compensate, because I always wonder. Well, first of all, I come from Europe, Italy specifically, which is very lagging behind in this conversation, I must say. Europe recently approved the legal framework, AI Act. But if you look into this legal framework, searching for the word culture, you will find it mentioned once, maybe twice, just in a bullet point list, a shopping list of things to take care and just be aware that they're there. So that's the first thing that I want to say. But let's focus on the good. In my work with cultural heritage regeneration, preservation, etc., I must recognize there are some benefits. For example, AI is able to augment the information available in the ecosystem of cultural heritage. It can free space for research and less standardized work, of course. It can also help enhance the access to cultural content to people who maybe don't have it in a more popular, in a more pop and visible and diffuse way. The digitization of cultural heritage offers original ways to its adaptation to the changes of society. It can create a sort of memory insurance policy for cultural heritage in the event of total or partial disruption or loss, which we are witnessing very dramatically recently. But regardless of the extent to which AI is using cultural heritage preservation practice or valorization, it is essential to me to clarify who bears the responsibility, of course, for the decision based on an algorithm, especially when those decisions risks exacerbating dramatically the social inequalities and increasing polarization of society, which in the place I come from is already striking. So to me, it's essential to define first whether the algorithm can be considered to some extent agents, and second, whether their political responsibility lies only with individuals, such as developers, computer scientists, or also to end users, such as architects, cultural creators, archaeologists, and of course, the cultural community. So regarding the first point, in our research, we recognize that AI, when it interacts with the physical space, acquires agency. It needs the physical space, like city, to thrive, to materialize. So it's a codependency, in my opinion, because it collects data, it informs decisions that shape our public sphere, and in the city, the space of AI directly intersect with the space of human life without barriers. We touch AI, basically, we touch robots, we touch platforms. In smart city debate, technology was always debated as a passive tool, something that is kind of hidden. If you think about smart grids, they were underground, so you cannot see them, but now we see AI everywhere. But now that we have this visible and popular and tangible dimension of AI, I think it's necessary to understand how it appears to be capable of acting as well as sensing, which was typical of smart cities. So it becomes an active agent capable of influencing social dynamics, political engagement, and cultural expression. Concerning the second assumption, after recognizing that AI is an urban agent, we must also be aware that digital platforms, the infrastructure driving AI, are not neutral. They are political actors in their own rights. Their decisions reflect the ideology and power structure that govern the creation, and they can influence the flow of information, shape public opinion sometimes, and can even steer protests and social movements. In some cases, they have even substituted or surpassed political figures. They are becoming smart urban intermediaries, especially when the urban intermediation is lagging behind. So this stresses to me the need for framework that support rather self-governance and especially local control over cultural content. And a possible way to go that we are trying to implement in my research group, in my work, in daily work, is to focus on the process, the slow, deliberate engagement of multi-level interests from citizens to cultural institutions, again, formal and informal, in decision-making around AI and cultural heritage. So this means creating arenas for conversation, for interaction, and not only reaction, intermediate spaces where people ensure authenticity by participating in shaping how AI technologies are integrated into public life. All this is the attempt we are trying to put into work with the work of Civic Digital Twin for the City of Bologna, which is a collective research project that we are implementing together with the city, a rich body of local stakeholders, and of course, with the ambition to engage a citizenship around it. So this project stresses two important dimensions. First, it focuses on the socio-technical process of reproducing this twin of the city, and not just the technical dimension itself. And second, it highlights the unique characteristic of the local urban cultural heritage in contrast of the generic idea of the city as an abstract entity. So among the non-technical challenges, what do? We consider collaboration among stakeholders from the beginning of the process of construction of this digital replica, stressing the sensitivity of information and the ability to translate data into understandable insight, to build trust in the process and the overall strengthening of the capacity of the actors involved. Regarding the dimension of local cultural heritage, we observe that data-driven urban regeneration can be very easily overlooked structural vulnerability at local dimension level, and most commonly drive universal model of planning and decision making that are not meant to work across every socio-political context, so at local levels. So to move from policy abstract dimension to meaningful transformative action, we suggest that interacting around images, something that is more narrative, could be a way to go. However, when we talk about images and something visible and narration, AI-built images are often similar. There's always a tendency to portray the same architecture, usually high-tech architecture, traditional iconographic elements portraying heritage, always tangible heritage, monumental, museum, and so on. The same vegetation, full-grown, bright green and healthy, and the same commercial activities, fixed, mainly formal, and the same people walking on the street. So in order to overcome this risk of generalization of these images, I think an art-science collaboration can be beneficial because artists can produce a representation of cultural heritage that can be anywhere in the world, but yet familiar to it. This collaboration can consider the choice of symbols and the correct balance between simplicity and detail. So in Italian, we describe this project like a scommessa, which is translated as a high-stakes bet, and I hope it will make it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just recalibrating on the prompt, but if I spoke at a 10,000 foot level in my opening comments, maybe I'll narrow my focus. So like there's a lot of really fascinating and interesting things happening, both within cultural heritage scholarship in the ways that you're describing. I have a colleague who just recently used SPORE data to then use generative AI to reconstruct the nature landscape of what might have been in ancient cultures. Again, it was, of course, very green and very lush, and there was no environmental stress or anything like that happening. But I think there's a way in which, like so many technologies, these tools allow us to ask some new questions, to quickly imagine counterfactuals and kind of loosen up the hold, even as most scholars want to keep their work data grounded. But in the space of museums in particular, I think there's some real interesting possibilities that I think are in line with a lot of movement to better democratize the museum as an institution, to open it up to new audiences, right, who feel like compelled to go and engage with the work, to take a hard look at the limits of current collections and begin to imagine how those might be opened up. And then also to even understand from the point of view of museum practitioners what's already in a particular collection, right? The ways in which our habits of curating and our norms of curating have reproduced a certain kind of sameness. And so this idea of bringing the unexpected into the space. But I think all of those challenges are should be thought of against what was said earlier about these. At least a lot of when we talk about AI, we mean big AI, right? And that we don't have an ecosystem of alternative modes, or alternative organizations and institutions that are producing mid-level, small-level machine learning and AI that could be so that if you're an under-resourced institution, where do you turn? You turn to what's freely available, and so you're perpetuating the very system where getting a desktop support person at a museum maybe is more than having like an AI specialist, even as we want to be thinking about these things together. So how can we come back to art science as a mode moving forward? How can we develop some partnerships where these kinds of questions and these kinds of applications are seen as worthy of development, not at the level of profit making in that master sense, but in this broader senses of the cultural good of art and other forms of cultural expression.
So I want to talk about the policy thing for a bit. In Canada, any question, whenever we immediately ask, what are the policy or what policy could we come up with? So I recently read this quote, one of many with similar titles, edited by Federico Gurudo and several other people, called Artificial Intelligence and the City. And it talks about at one point this phenomenon that the authors called the urbanization of AI. Now, this is the panel. Urban is in the title of this term, correct? Or no?
Environment.
Okay, but so if it isn't, that's even more interesting because nevertheless we end up talking about it. Why do we assume that at least the most interesting, if not the most urgent parts of AI have to do with cities? And this interests me. And the larger question, I guess, if so much of the key case studies and the questions around AI have to do with cities, is urban policy the appropriate level at which we collectively decide what we're going to do with it? What about nations and so on? This interests me in part, and I apologize to Justin Serby, say some stuff about this before. We can simply say cities are the right scale, for the implementation of autonomous driving and the other sort of famous cases. Cities work better as laboratories than, say, nations as a whole. We can imagine, in China now, where they're planning various kinds of AI healthcare initiatives, there's this idea that these cities will be first laboratories and then the results will be shared with others. But I would argue as well, and I don't want to go on too long about this, that this urbanization of AI replicates the urbanization of many other things. What I've argued for many years, and I'm not the only one, is that ideas of citizenship have become increasingly urbanized. In Canada and Quebec, provincial and national governments, for decades sort of tried to inculcate versions of national citizenship, but that sort of ran up against for what was for them the messy questions of defining a national culture or the challenges of technology. Cities, without necessarily planning it, moved in and sort of offered versions of citizenship that seemed to win over people. Cities seem to be able to, let you think of your citizenship as something having to do with your proximity to others, representing various kinds of diversities and so on. Anyways, so I would say culture has been urbanized. Urban art forms, placemaking, arts of urban intervention, but relational aesthetics about 15 years ago. So many of the interesting developments in art have had to do with being together or with being in places, and those are urban questions. And cities have become principal funders, at least in Canada, of culture, and certainly the generators of more ideas about culture than provinces or nations. So to get back to AI, I'll just ask the question, is the city the appropriate level at which AI is tried out, implemented, judged, funded, and so on? I mean, I know you have an interest in procurement. I mean, is the AI being urbanized in part because it's cities that buy the platforms of the programs, and so that the cities then become the realm in which these are sort of seen and judged? I'll stop there, but I just want to ask whether the urbanization of AI that Kugrel and others have talked about has something to do with the urbanization of citizenship and can have something to do with the ways in which culture itself is increasingly urbanized.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the procurement comment. I do like procurement of an office. I appreciate bringing ways that are both sensible component into the conversation as well. But I would like to ask the audience, both in person and online, if they have any question. Great. Yeah. My name is Priti Sharma. I'm a first year PhD student at the Department of History, and I have two questions for you. One is around federalism. I know that we've talked so much about urbanization and creating city spaces where that AI can flourish, but at the same time have much more regulatory control and much faster response. And I was wondering if what you will think, perhaps like how federalism itself is gonna shape up, and how that means for you, and how do you look at that in the future. And another thing that I wanted to talk about was actually on the environment. And I was wondering, I was reading this book, The Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford, and the opening paragraph she talks about, it is very, very material. I mean, I from her from a book, I got a sense that AI in the coming years is going to be divided between those who have needs and those who do not. And how do you see that also shaping up something that I would
Yeah, thank you. There. I think for your first question, you talk about the federalism of AI. I think that is a tough thing to do, and I think it goes right back to your point. It's like, is the city the petri dish? Because cities are going to naturally be more homogenous, especially in the U.S. We identify our city. I'm from Philly. When I see anybody from Philly, I can tell you a little bit about them, right? And I'm like, we're not New Yorkers. We're not, Atlanteans. We're not, you know what I mean? Like, that's the identity. So it's easier to have a system or infrastructure of AI that fits the city, where if we go to a federal or, a larger or even just a state or province point of view, in our state of Pennsylvania, Philly is very alone, where the rest of the state is very different than Philadelphia. So how would the state kind of regulate or be the petri dish? And then if you bring it up to an even larger level federally, our states are, you guys know, divided in many places. So when you're looking at regulating or creating an AI environment that is, federally based, I think that will be difficult. But the role that federalism or the federal kind of infrastructure plays, I think, is the stopgap measures, the rails for it, right? It shouldn't be creating the environment, but also saying, hey, this is where we will draw the line with what we allow AI to do, to create, to control, even with decision making. I think there should be some federal guideline on what we allow AI to make. AI should not be making life or death decisions. AI should not be making decisions about people, citizenship, where they don't, like, those can be, but you can, kind of bring that down to the kind of the other part there. Does that give some context?
But while I'm listening, I'm also thinking, what is an argument being made there that people are different and people have different needs while they're situated in a particular place? Why not have that conversation with people, give them the opportunity, and see, oh, this is what the demand requires from a city, then the local legislators, the local lawmakers are better placed. Yes, I can think of a federally, a federal guideline, so to say, but that's going to be so generalized. Then it doesn't seem to me that if I have a specific need, I don't think a federally mandated law is going to help me. And in that sense, that I am seeing even more gap that in a regulatory response that comes in, because we can't expect a very quick response from the federal government, but we can do that from the state government or from
That's questionable, but I've seen some city governments say, but I think the part of it is, it goes back to something that was said when the first answer, that AI shouldn't be making policy, right? We're talking about policy. It needs to be a human thing. It can help with the research for policy, it can help with the gathering of thought, maybe information, but the policy decision needs to be made by someone who can look at what's good for the greater good and the individual. Because again, when you look at morality of AI, we as humans, we applaud somebody that runs into a burning building, to say, well, we'll send 5 people to a burning building and save 1, which AI may look at and like, well, you're risking 5 lives for 1. But us as humans, the morality of it is that everybody matters. If you let AI make policy based on the available data or percentages or what makes sense, sometimes you'll forget about the certain people, right? And so when you go to a city level again, there's a lot more of, I guess, cohesive needs that are in city. That's why we choose our cities. But even when you go to a neighborhood level, even within cities, neighborhoods are very different. We're a city of neighborhoods in Philly. So again, I think AI will never be able to capture that because again, it's based off that data, and the individual may not have as much data out there as the whole. And so that's why I think when you look at an AI, the guidelines can be federal and they should be general, but the actual implementation of it needs to stay, especially at policy point, with humans.
Yeah, just building on that a little bit. Those are great questions too. One thing that kind of strikes me, in relation to federalism and just thinking about all the different perspectives we've raised here today is I think we're all really asserting the power of localized forms of governance in some way or another, right? Whether it's through city governments or individual communities, different working with intercultural institutions, AI urbanism, or like worker-led, community-led forms of governance. These are all more localized models, right? And I think the interest in that and this turn to localized governance and like AI localism that we're kind of seeing recently is really in response to the failure of federalism. AI governance at the federal level has been a thing of interest for almost 10 years now. And there's been very little actual regulatory intervention from the federal level here in the US. I'm very familiar with Canada, where I've followed our federal government's AI policy quite closely, and there's lots of guidance out there here. For example, we might think about, the White House AI Bill of Rights, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, the AI Executive Order guidance with some degrees of legal force, and there's been lots of attempts here in Congress to create various legislative instruments for specific use cases, whether it's for algorithmic decision-making, government, deep fakes, but they don't really get off the ground. That kind of federal level legislative, there hasn't been support needed to actually bring that into law. And this question of federalism, I think part of it has to do with, as you get up in scale, governments become slower and slower moving. And because AI moves so quickly, more localized forms of governance, whether it's from city governments or communities within cities or distributed communities across spaces, or workplaces, unions, that has come to fill the vacuum. And to address the second part of that too, it's like apples of AI and this growing amplification of various forms of inequity that we're seeing coming about and how that relates into the governance piece as well. I think that's a site also where localized forms of governance have a role to play. Just thinking about just the massive scale of the AI systems that are discussed in Atlas about how the supply chain extends material, software resources, data outsourcing to all kinds of different countries all over the world, particularly in the global south. Well, then the question becomes, how can federalism address these transnational issues? But there again, I think we can think about like localized forms of governance, whether it's various forms of transnational organizing or more sectoral forms of governance, setting sources on standards of ethical sourcing within a sector, within an industry, right? But I think maybe like a theme throughout many of the responses here is like AI localism being kind of like in tension with federalism. Something said again.
Yeah, I think another thing that with the equity part too is tough is that to be able to pay to get a better AI, I think is problematic. Like I do pay for ChatGPT for something that gets current information, where the free one is like a lag of 2 years. I think that's where equity issues will start being a problem there, because if you can't afford the paid, up-to-date, most relevant or larger scope and information one, then you'll be limited and lagging in your ability to make decisions on the information that you get from AI, which will create an equity issue, which will create a kind of this silencing of voice issue. Because if I walk in and I ask ChatGPT for and it gave me information A, and you're 2 years behind, I look better or well equipped than you inside. It's a matter of access to information, kind of how we originally treated the internet. And now everybody's seeing the internet as like it should be a basic human right now to have access to that. But I think that's a big part of the equity as well.
Maybe I'll pick up on the environmental piece as well. I think Kate Crawford's work is fantastic in drawing attention to the ways in which this any intervention in this space is built upon a global supply chain that has deep inequities built into it. The production of the machines are often the worst moments. So the point of our using them, AI is interesting in this way, given its operational needs, the ways in which obsolescence is built into this and this kind of GPU race. I mean, there's a driving force that's really exacerbating that. And when it comes to the question of where to intervene and at what level, I mean, what cities get to become smart and what cities are left to be dumping grounds for the, recycling the, put in a plug for a fantastic book, African Ecomedia from Duke Press, that really engages with these questions. But I agree wholeheartedly about local articulations, like local antagonisms and the ways in which, I also wonder how those can be articulated. This is the classic problem of how to deal in this neoliberal moment with transnational corporations operating above and outside of government practice. And yet we see the power of local movements. So how do those get articulated in ways that have effects? And maybe we need to look at those local effects, right? And rather than, I think I concur around being skeptical of broader regulation.
I think you bring up something as well, and we all kind of hit on it, is we have to be careful where we think AI is best. It's a little bit like, we're looking at cities, right? We want to make our cities smart, but the cities of tomorrow aren't always the cities of today, right? We can't put all of the AI into our big cities and forget about smaller towns, because again, I think if you want equity in how it is used, what we learn from AI in a small town is just as important to inform what we use it at a big town as well. And I think when you look at the rollout of local governments, you have, a city government looking at being a smart city, and another government's like, hey, we want an easy way of life. Well, I think you can do both of those things when it comes to investing, and especially when it comes to the policy making. Then even to the federalist point of view, it's like, we're too integrated as a country. And that's why we always butt heads to have a rule in one place that doesn't apply in another. And, that's where we get so complicated as America. And some other countries are a little bit more homogenous in their rules because, the states have a little bit less of that power. Even with AI, it's like, okay, if I say in Philadelphia, you can do ABC with AI, and then in Charlottesville you can. What does that create? How does that add to the inequity, and how does that prevent mobility of people? Because then you'll start marginalizing people who can't go other places because of the lack of information that they don't want to give up or things that they want to see. So we got to be careful in that as well.
Okay, my name is Andre. I'm with the DTD, the Digital Technology for Democracy Lab. I'm a sociologist, and I would like to ask a question, based on this discussion of holocau, in the sense that AIs are trained with data, and data isn't given from God, it's constructed by people. And in that sense, there is a lot of communities that don't have the same ability to produce data or to feed data into machines that are very expensive and very localized. So we're talking about tools that are used by very specific peoples in very specific places. So you gave us an example about the bars. There are jazz bars in communities that are not considered safe. But we could be talking about native reservations. We talk about different countries having different states in this matter. We're going to talk about how can we think this something that can be used by communities that don't have any computational power or any kind of saying which data is produced. I have difficulties, for example, of creating such types of arts that are from Brazil that they're non-existent in this mid journeys and all these generators. So how can we think about more localized or more culturally based discussion of this kind of creativity being appropriated by certain companies at certain places and certain capacities, in the sense of it's a way of producing generalities and not localized arts or expression or anything.
Yeah, I mean, there was lots of interest in what you said. I mean, if we think of the local as always a point of resistance to these globalizing forces, well, then AI is the globalizing force, and the localism of art will somehow resist that, or should. I mean, it interests me because there's so much talk about experimental cities in relationship to AI. So art, cities have also been seen as laboratories of art. The more they try and be that, are they just rushing after AI, trying to be as experimental, trying to find ways that, hey, we're changing too? Or is art somehow a resistance in its localism? Is there a way in which it can participate in AI without losing that localism, without surrendering it to the forward force of everything else? I mean, is art necessarily decelerationist, whereas AI is accelerationist? All these questions interest me, and I'd be interested in what people might have to say. Thoughts?
We have to wrap up really. So I just want to give Martina an opportunity.
Yeah, no, just very, very quickly. I liked your question because that's what I wonder every day in my work. What I think we all mentioned that AI is an infrastructure. It can also be a relational infrastructure. If we think about physical infrastructure, bridges, streets, we used to use maps to make sense of this infrastructure, no? So I think we kind of lost a navigation map to understand this type of infrastructure, how it affects the territories, which are not only cities that we are working through and within, even with our daily practice. So that's something that I think I don't have the answer, but it's something that really strikes me. Thank you for your question.
I'll add one thing because I think, what you're talking about, whose responsibility is it to ensure that we feed AI all of the data because data is going to make it stronger? And maybe that goes back to a federal responsibility. Maybe it's a requirement that every municipality has someone dedicated to ensure that small municipality, whether it's a neighborhood or a city or a town, is uploading data that is relevant to just them, to the system or to AI. And how is that done? And that can be something, again, like you said, building that infrastructure, like having a road or a bridge. We have the AI infrastructure. So we know, maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, every city or every township or every just municipality or every town with a mayor has a role to update and add to the grid of data so that every culture is represented and the tool becomes stronger.
If you have time, I can make one final addition to that. I mean, just building on this point of, what could the role of federal government be perhaps in advancing localism? And it might be worth taking a look at one initiative that's recently been launched in Canada. So this is kind of within the bracket of like public AI infrastructure more broadly, and the need to make more public AI infrastructure, whether it's open data sets, open models, compute power, whatever it is that academics, communities, small businesses, like smaller, more under-resourced actors within the ecosystem can use. So the idea is to just kind of have this big fund. In our case, in Canada, it's just a public compute initiative to make a lot more compute power available. But this could conceivably be expanded to create more open data as well, in addition to open compute, creating more open models too, and then having some kind of funding vehicle or investment vehicle where if you're a community organization or whatever else and you want access to some of these funds, whether it's to one more computer for an open data project to meet the needs of a particular community or cultural project, that you can apply to be part of this initiative and to develop or to benefit from that public AI infrastructure. So that is one role that federalism could play, kind of like linking up, supporting the local level, is by providing, I think, those kinds of funding vehicles that can go down to the local level. And then, rather than the federal government saying, this is what every community across the country needs, communities can kind of say, hey, here's what we need to do. Can you please, count some of this pool of money in some way?
So thank you very, very much. Unfortunately, we don't have more time, but I know we have more questions. We'll be around. Feel free to talk to us. And I would say one of the main questions of this workshop is you can reimagine AI. If you could reimagine these AI systems from the ground up, what would they look like? So this probably drove their question. And I would like to please sign up to maybe to have a publication putting out of this workshop that will connect to them and would love to share it with you or keep an eye on our social media as well. And I I want to say thank you very much again for being here. Thanks very much.